Hello. Today I'd like to introduce a couple of extracts from my English Requiem. Now, this is a piece which was given its first performance last November, the 14th of November, here in Oxford at Keble College Chapel, and it was given by the very excellent Arcadian singers of Oxford University, conducted by Jacob Ewens. It was a very impressive occasion, actually. Keble College Chapel is a famous Victorian chapel. It's quite big, and it was really full. It was an amazingly big audience turned up for this event, and it went very well, and everyone seemed to be quite moved by the occasion. The occasion was partly a concert that I dreamt up myself, which was to commemorate the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, or the Great War, as I prefer to call it. Now, I'd had the idea for some time that it would be good to have an event like that, and I wrote a couple of pieces specially for this event, and the Arcadian singers and some other performers very kindly collaborated and performed these works. So the background of the thing is this, that for me, as I'm sure for a lot of people, the Great War is an event in our history which is really almost unparalleled. I mean, for modern times, for Britain and the world in modern times, the effect of the First World War has been enormous, and it's not unfair to say that it was a kind of a watershed. It was the end of an era. The whole, certainly for Europe, the whole of the kind of 19th century Victorian Europe, Victorian and Edwardian Europe was largely destroyed. And although Britain wasn't destroyed in quite the same way as a lot of continental European countries, for example Russia with the Russian Revolution, it has affected this country very much ever since, and the centenary, I think, for a lot of people was a very important occasion. It has a kind of unique status in our consciousness, I think, and I think that's one of the reasons that so many people turned up. Actually, I think a lot of people felt a need for something that would mark this occasion in an appropriate manner. And I think the concert we did actually manage to do that very well. I was very pleased about that. So, the thing that, of course, strikes people so much about the First World War is the gigantic loss of life. It was the first fully mechanised modern war, and people had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. You know, it's the classic thing that they thought it'd be over by Christmas and so on. Turned into this 4-year epic in which millions died. On the British and British Commonwealth side, it was something like 1 million men died, and it was even worse. It was even worse for other combatant countries. And from the British point of view, it's fair to say that a whole generation was decimated, and many of the brightest and best of that generation were killed or wounded or affected psychologically by this disaster, and nothing was ever quite the same again after that. And I think that's what I was trying to commemorate. And what I did was I wrote a piece which combines choral movements, which are settings of words from the Psalms, and then it combines those with poems. And I chose poems by generally not very well known war poets of the First World War. In fact, a couple of them were people I'd never heard of myself at that point, that for me reflects the way that a lot of these young men, some of the poets didn't survive, of course, a lot of these young men at that time went off, and like most people at that time, they believed very much in what they were doing. They were fighting, as they would have put it, they were fighting for king and country, or for God's king and country was one of the phrases they used to use, against what they saw as militarism and barbarism. And it is true, I mean, this is something that people argue about, but the the Germans, when they invaded Belgium, did behave with unparalleled brutality. And this is one of the things that caused a great wave of patriotic enthusiasm in Britain and other countries, the feeling that somebody had to go and stop this kind of thing from happening. And we see the Great War through the lens of later reactions to it. In the 20s and 30s, there was a great reaction against the Great War. There was a kind of cynicism. There was this implication which went on later. People like the historian A.J.P. Taylor, in his famous book, The Causes of the First World War, basically put forward this idea that it really was an unnecessary war and that it was all about economic rivalry between Britain and Germany and other countries, and people wanting to expand their empires, and it was all unnecessary. Well, that may be so and it may not. I don't actually agree with that. I think that it was necessary because Germany basically was a military dictatorship, an aggressive military dictatorship, which was actually quite clearly intent on dominating Europe and also taking colonies in the rest of the world. And they made it quite clear. I mean, years before, German generals had written books explaining what they wanted to do and why they needed a war and why Germany should be a proper great power and it should control Europe. So there was a need to resist that, just as there was a need to resist the Nazis in the Second World War. People will argue about that, some people don't agree. But anyway, there's a kind of general consensus, and it's influenced by war poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who reflected the horror and the futility of war. Nobody will deny the horror and futility that happened. You can't get away from it. But what I would probably deny is that it was a futile waste of time and a waste of life. It was a terrible waste of life on all sides, and it was very tragic. But I think it's possible to argue that it was better to have tried to resist what was happening, even if it did mean people dying, than just giving in to militarism and barbarism. Anyway, that's my take on it. And this work, it's not at all political. What I'm trying to do in an English Requiem is really just to pay tribute to the state of mind of the young men that went off to fight. Whether you think they were right, whether you think they were wrong, I think that you have to pay respect to the fact that they were prepared to do what they did. And so the poems I chose, on the whole, they're not so much reflecting the horror of the thing. The first one, maybe, by Ivor Gurney, does reflect that, but the others, by Alec de Candolle, for example, are more meditative. They're more about the way that people, even in the middle of horror and of war, can rise above it and look beyond. In any case, the pieces here that I'm using are two choral movements. So, for various technical reasons, I can't put the solo movements on, but I wanted to just put two choral movements on to give a flavour of the piece. The first one is the one that opens the work, and it's God is our hope and strength. And then the second one later on is the Lord is my light. These are both from the Psalms. The first one, obviously, God is my hope and refuge, is about the idea that in the midst of trouble and conflict and war, it's possible perhaps to appeal to something higher and to think of something higher and have some sense of refuge beyond the suffering. And then the Lord is my light is a faster movement. It's there partly for contrast, but it's more of a kind of moment of illumination, the idea that beauty and light and so on can penetrate even into the darkness. And then the work ends with everybody coming together in a very consolatory psalm. Lord, thou hast been our refuge through every generation. I'm not illustrating that here, but here we are, the two sections sung by the Arcadian singers. God is our refuge and strength, and the Lord is my light, from my English Requiem. So I hope you find them of interest. Also, I'll put a link to the Arcadians website, and you might like to know more about the Arcadians. They've got more recordings and so on there as well. So thank you very much.